And I'm admitting everybody now.
And can we chat?
No, so the audience chats with me and then I'll relay the questions at the end.
No, I mean, can we chat now, Emma?
Oh, yeah, you can chat now. Yeah, sure. If you can see people coming in, they can hear you and see you. They just can't respond.
Like waiting.
Lovely. Okay, well, we might get started now that everybody's admitted. So good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to this evening's Avid Reader Zoom session. Tonight we have Alice and Ansara in conversation with Julie Janson for the launch of Julie's novel, Benevolence. We are really excited to have this event on tonight. For any of you joining us interstate, Avid Reader is a small independent bookstore in Brisbane's West End. And we are really, really excited to have this launch this evening. So before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I'm currently broadcasting, the Yagara and Turrbal people. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Before I hand over to our speakers tonight, I'd just like to go over some of the information that I sent to you in my email with the event link earlier. So we're a really big group tonight, which is wonderful, but in order to reduce the potential for any disruption, you've automatically all been placed on mute and you'll remain so throughout the event, but I will unmute you all at the end so that you can say hello and thank you to tonight's speakers. So later in the evening, there may be time for some audience questions. And in that case, if you do have any questions, please send them to me via the chat box. They'll automatically come to me and I'll read them out along with your name towards the end of the event. If you drop out of the session for any reason, then you can use the same link to reconnect as you did to join us this time around. The same I'll admit you as soon as possible, and the same applies for if our speakers drop out. They're sharing a Zoom feed tonight, so it will be both of them. In that, if the odd chance that happens, it hasn't happened yet, touch wood, then we'll take a quick break, I'll readmit them, and we'll resume the event from there. So now that I've gone through that whole spiel with you, I would love to introduce Alice and Ansara, who will be in conversation with Julie Janson tonight. Alice has been an actor across film, TV and theatre, performing for major theatre companies across Australia and film credits garnering her AFI nominations and various awards. As an ensemble member and dramaturg at the Sydney Theatre Company, she worked with Australia's leading contemporary playwrights, and as a community radio broadcaster, she interviews and makes radio documentaries. Alice is also an interviewer for the National Film and Sound Archives Oral History. So Alice, I would now like to hand over to you.
Thank you. I first of all would like to say that our internet connection has just gone a little unstable. So if we are the first in your series to drop out, please everybody let us know. So Julie and I are Zooming to you from the tragically burnt and beautiful far south coast of New South Wales. On this side of the town, now known as Muraging, we're in Walbunja country, on the lands of the Yuin Nation, and we pay our respects to Yuin elders, past, present and emerging. And I think as we launch Julie's wonderful novel, Benevolence, we pay our special respects to Indigenous women elders, past, present and emerging, their strength and resilience. And we acknowledge that the land we live on, live off, admire and exploit, the land we write on, create on, discuss and do book launches on, this land was certainly never ceded. Which brings us perfectly and fittingly to the novel that we are here tonight to celebrate and launch, Julie Janson's Benevolence. Here it is. The story of Muraging, a Darug girl who was born in the early 1800s in the Hawkesbury River area and handed over to the Parramatta Native School, set up by Governor Macquarie, and as such is part of that earliest of Darug generations to experience the full impact of colonisation. Muraging's tale in Benevolence is one of loss and longing, horror and heartache. And at the same time, because Benevolence does what all good literature does, it boldly takes us into the grey areas, those shady places of ambiguity and conceptual camouflage. And through Julie's incisive writing, Muraging's story is also one of bravery, resistance, and survival. I'll let Julie talk more about the book in just a moment, but I would like to talk about Julie. Most writers don't enjoy talking about themselves, even though they write their memoirs over and over again in their apparent works of fiction. But it brings me great pleasure to briefly discuss the woman who is able to write this marvellous work, Benevolence, and the path that she has taken to deliver it to you. Julie Janson grew up in Boronia Park, Sydney, at that time still a place of bushland, but also much housing commission. Julie, like her protagonist Muraging in Benevolence, had a child at a relatively young age, whilst at the same time began her involvement in Sydney's burgeoning and lively film and theatre movement. Honing her craft in playwriting, Julie has gone on to write many celebrated plays, amongst them Gunges, a work about Aboriginal deaths in custody, in which a ghost appears and a death is avenged. Gunges won the highly commended Australian Human Rights Award and was followed by another Belvoir Street production of Julie's Black Mary, a play about a female Indigenous bushranger who roams northwestern New South Wales in the mid-19th century. A witness to massacres, Mary nevertheless survives in the outback and most of the time eludes capture. Do we see some themes emerging? I think so. Other plays of Julie's include Lotus Wars and The Eyes of Muraging, which was performed at the Opera House and Adelaide Festival Centre. These historical plays explore our country's relationship to Southeast Asia. Throughout all of this time, Julie had babies. She reared children. No mean feat for women who are doggedly determined to keep up their creative careers. And she also was and continues to be a passionate educator, sharing her craft by teaching it. Julie's career as a teacher began with a teacher's scholarship to the University of New South Wales. After graduating, she went to live and work in Bourke for a year, a single mother with a baby in the 1970s, lest we forget what an outlaw that made her. She then went to teach at an Aboriginal school on a remote cattle station near Katherine, and later taught at Elcho Island in Arnhem Land. Back in Sydney, Julie taught at the University of Sydney's Koori Centre. From these lived experiences, especially in the Northern Territory, came Julie's first novel, The Crocodile Hotel, an epic story about a young Aboriginal single mother from the western suburbs of Sydney who goes to Arnhem Land for a year of teaching in 1976. The book is filled with humour, vivid characters, a good dose of sex, and a great exploration of the beginnings of the land rights movement. The Crocodile Hotel is like all of Julie's subsequent works, in that the novel is a provocation to challenge what you know and understand to be Australia's history. Julie's second novel, The Light Horse Ghost, an historical fiction that follows its protagonist Iris growing up in the goldfields of Western Australia after 1918, is about a family haunted by the magic realism of a war horse, and moreover, in a country haunted by colonialism, racism, patriarchy, and war. The idea for this book originated with Julie's mother, who is of English heritage, saying to her, "Why don't you write a nice book about middle-class white people and then people might buy it?" Well, in The Light Horse Ghost, Julie tried. Amongst the novels sits Julie's poetry. In 1916, Julie was the co-recipient of the Udjuru Noonuccal Poetry Prize for Juria Burramarang, Eagle Hawk Time, and in 2019 was awarded the Judith Wright Poetry Prize for Acacia Land. Again, we see Julie's poetry filled with the vitally important themes of the ways in which we as a nation are haunted, consciously or unconsciously, by the destructive weight of colonialism and all that goes with it. Julie's third novel, Benevolence, revisits, refreshes, reimagines these themes and shouts, screams back at them with the feminine spirit of survival, resistance, and regeneration. So friends, without further ado, Julie Janson, who will read, I think, the opening paragraph of Benevolence for you, and then talk about how she came to write this work.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction to the wonderful Alice. And thank you to avid readers as well. But just before I start, I also want to do a big thank you to Mugaballa Books. Mugaballa Books stood by me for 5 years with this book and supervised me rewriting it 5 times. So without that support and the support of Rachel Bensala and Margaret Wiskin, the editor, I don't think the book would ever have seen the light of day. So I'm incredibly grateful to them for really making me work extremely hard to make sure that this book was as acceptable as it's become. So I'd like to read just the opening paragraph of the novel. 1816, Muraging is given away in Parramatta. The grey-green eucalypts clatter with the sound of cicadas. Magpies and currawongs warble across the early morning sky as the sun's heat streams down. It is eaglehawk time, the season of Muraging, when the land is dry and these birds fly after small game. Muraging's clan, the Burrabarungal of the Darug people, gather their dilly bags and coolamans and prepare for the long walk to Parramatta, the land of eels, and Parramatta town. The old women stamp out a fire and one gathers the baby boy in her arms and ties him onto her possum skin cloak. Muraging hears rattling carts full of waibala, whitefella, and the sound of pots against iron wheels. She looks back and sees the deep wheel marks, the huge snake tracks, and hurries after her father, Barinji. He gives her a waibala coat of red wool, so he loves her. He turns away and she watches the boy take her place. She can see the love between man and boy. You going to ask me some questions?
Yes, well, I would love to know. First of all, I'm sure we all would love to know the genesis of this novel, Julie. I mean, I'm sure it has many, but how did you come to write it?
Well, about 7 years ago, I was employed by Professor Peter Reid at the University of Sydney in the History Department to work as one of the Aboriginal researchers on a large project called the History of Aboriginal Sydney. And he employed a number of people of Indigenous descent to go out and talk to elders and others and to gather photographs and videos and go to the Mitchell Library and uncover the stories that hadn't been written about Sydney Aboriginal people. And it was really like a vacant ground in terms of information, so it required a lot of time spent in places like the Mitchell Library and in the the New South Wales Archives. And for me, I had the privilege of going out to the western suburbs of Sydney and up to places like Katoomba to interview Aboriginal elders. And it was an extraordinary 5 years with Peter Reid at the helm. He's a most wonderful professor of history and a great writer himself, the man who established Link Up with Coral Edwards. Anyway, with Peter's encouragement, I gathered a lot of these interviews and I began to see similar stories unfolding in the western suburbs that were very similar to the stories that I'd been able to glean from research into my own family. And I found by listening to the stories of elders, and often the people I was talking to, they looked like my family, like my dad's family. They had that look of Aboriginal people, Darug people, but people who've also lived as Europeans for several generations. And I began to fill out all the gaps of the stories from my great-great Aboriginal grandmother and my great-great-great Aboriginal grandmother. And as I began to fill in those gaps and it began to become this wonderful website, The History of Aboriginal Sydney, I thought, someone's going to read these stories somewhere in the world, sitting in London or a journalist or something and say, what a marvellous lot of stories. I think I'll write a novel about it. So I thought, I'd better get in first and write that novel and kind of recreate the picture of an Aboriginal family, which is like my own, but I've had to imagine a lot of the stories and create them from my imagination because the true stories are hidden by time.
You've mentioned before that this book, Benevolence, is in a ways a bit of an answer book to another piece of literature.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that?
Well, when I read Kate Grenfell's wonderful book, The Secret River, which is a story about the Hawkesbury River, I was very moved by it, and it's a marvellous book. She's a wonderful writer. And the Andrew Bovell adaptation to stage is also an extraordinary work, which actually gave voice to Aboriginal people with using Darug language, by using Richard Green, the linguist, to help them with that language. But the ending of the book really bothered me tremendously, because there's a great big massacre and everybody on the Hawkesbury River, the Burrabirungal land where this particular English family is settled, they're all killed except one old man. And I knew this to be factually really incorrect. And it wasn't so much that it was getting history wrong, because let's face it, historical novelists do it all the time. You know, it's part of the pleasure of rewriting history in the way that you want to see it. But that it upset me, because it said to me that if all the Burrabirungal people of the Darug Nation were dead, then who were all the descendants that I'd met out in Blacktown? Who were my family? Who were the fair Aboriginal people who were descendants of the Darug? And what did that make us? Does that mean that we didn't exist, that we were all telling lies and we were all making it up? And I wanted to find the answers that would answer that question. So I guess without Kate's great book, I wouldn't have attempted to write Benevolence.
Mm.
Yeah.
And I mean, you do find some answers, particularly in the female protagonist.
Yeah, well, when I found documents that told me that great-great-grandmother worked as a servant on estates along the Hawkesbury River, and I read about those estates, and I realised they were land that was taken from Aboriginal people and given to often ex-convicts or sometimes people of so-called aristocratic background from England, and those estates were run like a fiefdom, and Aboriginal people and convicts and ex-convicts were employed as servants to split logs and work in the kitchens, and a lot of that work was unpaid, and people were paid by a bag of flour and a bit of meat and some tea, and were enslaved, really. The word slavery is what must come to mind. And in fact, in some of the estates, there are some old photographs which show Aboriginal people dressed in white uniforms, a bit like the slaves on the southern plantations in the United States. And so these stories of how people survived by working for Europeans explained a lot about survival and how people survived when they had no land had been taken from them. How do you live on the fringe of society as the lowest paid person and the lowest step of the ladder, the person who is spat upon and not paid? Because that's a universal story. You could be talking about people in Syria or in Yemen and people who've lost their land and have to suffer. And so I kind of engage with those ideas to try and recreate Mary's story. But I also have to write novelists. It's important that you also entertain, make them laugh, make them cry, like when we do theatre. You can't. If it's unrelenting misery, no one will want to read your book, and not only will they not want to read it, it'll make people incredibly unhappy. So, of course, every human experience has a lot of different levels of things that happen to people. So I enjoyed writing the sex, I enjoyed writing the jealous arguments. I enjoyed writing dialogue. So I'm a playwright originally.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, there are some, and I'm going to say scenes in the book because they feel like scenes.
Yeah.
Where the dialogue
mini
is really
plays.
rich. Yeah. So they're mini plays within the book, which obviously it brings to our attention your skill as a playwright.
Mm.
Do you find writing these particular passages different from writing other parts of the book?
I love it because it's when I get to use my playwright skills, and as any playwright will tell you, that you hear the voice in your head and you're typing away and you're using the crusty voice of the old man or the sweet voice and the voices just come into your head and they begin to talk to each other, and it's a great deal of excitement to get them down onto well, not on paper these days, onto a computer, and to let those voices and those people live in your head, and creating characters is a very exciting thing because they grow slowly with you. And I was explaining to Alice today, I have a friend who called out to me recently. He said, Julie, Mary's on the mountain. And I went, what the hell are you talking about? Because, you know, I mean, I finished this book like a year ago. He says, she's up the mountain. I said, Mary, who? He said, your book. And I'm like, oh, all right, okay. So for him, he was living that moment of being up on the mountain with Mary and the terrible things that happened to her up on that mountain. And but for him, you know, she was really real. He said, what happens next? I said, well, you're going to have to keep on reading to find out, you know. But she became a real person for him. And that's what happens, I think, when you write a novel or a play. Your characters become, they're like companions. We spend so much time alone in front of your computer as a writer, you know, it's a bit of a mad life, really. No one would do it if anyone really told you what it was like.
Mary, in Benevolence, is an incredibly well-rounded character. And, you know, some people say that every fiction is actually a work of autobiography or memoir. And there are elements of the Mary character that remind me of you, Julie.
Mm-hmm.
What part of Benevolence could you see as autobiographical, if any? I could be off the mark.
You're right, of course, you know. Means then that pretty well everything we're writing, we're just rewriting the same story over and over again, which is a bit depressing. I tend to write stories about single mothers because the period in my life when I've been a single parent has been the most vivid and, I'm about to say ghastly, but you know, it's a struggle. As any single parent will tell you, it's a struggle to be a single parent. So having Mary be a single parent for part of this novel, and my great grandmother was a single parent, as was my great grandmother, the Darug women in my family. They both spent periods of life as single parents, sometimes with 4 children, 4 of whom were taken by the Benevolent Society in the case of my great grandmother. So the fact of a woman really wanting to fight to stay alive and keep a roof over her head and food on the table just for her children, that to me is something that drives a lot of my stories. I just think and it's not to say that I haven't had some wonderful partners and a wonderful husband now who are very supportive, but you know, they do stand out those times when you have to do it on your own.
And you mentioned before the Hawkesbury River, which is very much a character in of itself in the book. I was about to say in the book. And we go to many locations, which I think is wonderful for a book about, and we have a map. We go to Windsor, Parramatta, Wiseman's Ferry,
Palm Beach.
Can you talk about writing country, writing location into your work?
Well, I think the Hawkesbury River in this book is really important to me. The Hawkesbury River is the first river really after Sydney Harbour that was colonised by the British. And it was very important out of Parramatta. The very first farms which grew wheat for the early colony were. So the Burrabirungal people and the Darug people suffered the first incursions of colonialism and destruction of their society and the taking of their lands. And it was along that river. And of course, rivers to Aboriginal people are very important. Rivers are song lines. That's where stories move along the river. They're a place where you get a lot of food, you know, a lot of fish and oysters and prawns. And it's also a place of transport. You transport yourself down the river in a canoe. And so the river, for me, was a major part of her story of how her life travelled along that river. And I was told when I was a child that we were Hawkesbury River people. The Aboriginal side of the family were Hawkesbury River people. So trying to make that river speak in the novel was very important to me. So it becomes a very important, and I get a lot of pleasure looking at the map and seeing, oh, where is she in the novel here on the map? And you could get little coloured markers and follow her as she travels down the river. And I actually lived on the river at Gentleman's Holt, and that's one of the scenes, I keep saying scenes too, in the novel where Mary lives with a child. And I lived on the river with my child, Morgan. I can see him up there in the corner. Hello, Morgan. He's waving. And we kind of ate lots of oysters, and we grew corn and had to fight the kangaroos for the corn. And I used to take him on a canoe down to Spencer to pick up food and supplies. And I was chased by some fishermen once who were calling out, you know, we want to catch you and do horrible things to you. And so a lot of those lived experiences of when I was young, I've recreated in this novel. Yeah.
I've got so many questions. I've just looked at the time. Do we only have until 7? Emma?
Sorry. No, you've got until 7:30. So depending on when you would like to go to questions, we haven't got any coming in yet, but I'll just remind you all now while I'm speaking to please send me any questions that you have for Julie. Generally, we'll go until 7:15, or 7:20. So yeah, however long you like.
Okay, great. So the Darug language, this Benevolence is full of it, which is one of the things that I love about it. There's so much language in this book. I'd love for you to talk to how that came about, the challenges of it, and how you want it to be read.
Well, I think it was last year, the New South Wales Parliament passed something or other, a promise that New South Wales Aboriginal languages would be protected. And I think the resurgence of both cultural practice and corroborees and language, I can only really speak for New South Wales at this point in my life, is a huge movement for Aboriginal people. An extraordinary corroboree movement, especially when the rivers were drying up along the Darling. And I think also the resurgence in wanting to understand what happened to the language and to bring the language back is very, very important to Aboriginal people and descendants of people like the Darug. So there's a very small collection of Darug words, really. And so in recreating the language in the novel, it's very important for me to use those words. And possibly I've made some mistakes. I absolutely put my hand up and say that that's completely possible. I'm not a linguist, but I love the sound of the language, and the reintroducing it amongst English, I think, allows people a tiny little way of understanding of what we have lost in the past and what's important to regenerate now.
And what resources did you call on for this?
There's a historian called Dr. Jim Cohen, who did a lot of research on Darug language and Darug people and Darug lineage, Darug heritage and families. Very, very important man. And he wrote a book of the Darug language, a vocabulary, and I use that extensively. And he also traced all the family trees for Darug descendants out in the western suburbs. And because of him, about 6,000 people have been able to be reconnected to their Aboriginal heritage, which they didn't really know very much about until he came and put together all of those family trees.
And you also write about botanical things a lot in the book, which was something that I adored. I mean, I think there's one...
The reverence into botanicals.
Right, no, but also just your observations of the botany. I'm trying to remember, there's one scene, again, I call it a scene,
yes.
Where they're making a bed and, you know, there's casuarina needles, and then on top of that, bracken fern, and then on top of that, possum cloak.
Right.
And the book is full of these beautiful observations. I'm wondering, how did you come to these?
It's an accident, I think. Well, one of the stories I love to tell about my dad Neville Janson, was with us kids. He'd take us from Boronia Park and we'd go off fishing for fishing weekends up the Hawkesbury River. Mum wouldn't want to go if she could avoid it, or Mum. And he'd take us hiking down to somewhere like Flint and Steel Beach, and we'd sleep in a cave. And in the cave, he made the beds like that, with casuarina needles and bracken ferns. And on top, he didn't have possum skin coats. He would lay down army greatcoats. I can't remember that they were uncomfortable, but it can't have been that comfortable. But I do remember waking up in the middle of the night one night when my younger brother, Brian, and he was screaming, and he was sitting bolt up in bed on his bracken bed. And there was a great big python had come down from the roof and was hanging over his head. And my father just looked over at the python, and, you know, we all woke up, the children were terrified, and my little brother, who was only about 5 or 6, was screaming. My father said, it's okay. That's a children's python. He's come to see who's living in his cave. He won't hurt you. And Dad basically turned over and went back to sleep. It's just like such a wonderful way of appreciating wildlife. He was a very gentle man in so many ways.
You've mentioned your dad, Neville, a few times now, and you know, one of my readings of this book is not as autobiography, but you know, what you bring to it is the protagonist who has this longing for her father, and is searching for her father and belonging, to a mob. Do you want to talk to that?
Well, Dad was killed in a car accident when I was 18. He liked to drink, and he had been drinking that night, and he didn't give way to the right. He was killed in a car accident. But I think for our family, for myself and my brothers, it was a devastating, and for my mother too, of course, a devastating time in our lives, and which totally tore the family apart from that point on. And we lost him far too soon. He was a great storyteller, a hilarious man in so many ways, great sense of humour, and a brilliant storyteller. And he could shimmy up a tree. When he was in the war in Borneo, he was in the Second World War in the army. They used to call him Jeddah the Gum Tree. And Jeddah, the only Aboriginal name they knew, woman's name. And he would shimmy up a coconut tree and cut off the coconuts and chuck them down to people. And I remember him in Boronia Park, he'd put an axe in the back, it seemed to be his back pocket, of the back of his shorts, and wearing nothing but a pair of shorts, he would climb up the tree, like this, and every now and then he'd stop and take an axe and cut a bit of a hole in it. Well, that's exactly what we've seen photographs of and drawings of Aboriginal men in New South Wales, how they used to get up the top of gum trees to rob the wild honey, and that's the kind of thing Dad would do. A real bushman, and yet he lived right in the heart of Sydney, right on the Lane Cove River. We'd collect all our oysters along the river. So wonder we weren't poisoned. I think they had the sewerage baths just down the road, but we'd get all our oysters and we'd row out on a leaking rowboat onto the Lane Cove River, myself and my brothers. I can't remember Dad being there, and put down traps for blue swimmer crabs and pull in the blue swimmer crabs. And past us would be the boys from Riverview College in their their rowing boats. What are they called?
Canoes.
No, they're not canoes. Anyway, stroke, stroke, stroke as they went past. Well, I married one of those boys many years later. So hilariously different childhoods, that's for sure.
So speaking of women and marriage, your protagonist, Muraging or Mary, has various liaisons, relationships with a range of different men.
Funny about that.
As I think we all have, haven't we?
Variety is the spice of life. Yes.
I'm just wondering, in terms of this theme of the particularly feminine or female ways of surviving, do you want to kind of describe some of these relationships?
Well, I know from the historical reading that I've read about the early 1800s that a lot of the young Aboriginal women who were at the Native School, which is the school set up by Governor Lachlan Macquarie, when they turned about 14 or 15, they would escape from the school. They would elope into the bush. And the teachers at the school would say things, oh, heavens above, they've eloped in the bush to go and live on vermin, worms and things. And in fact, the girls had simply gone to join their countrymen and gone off with a traditional husband, who'd come and kind of knocked on the window at night and helped them escape. And the idea of being very young and wanting to be with a male partner at that age, at 15 or 16, well, I think it's after puberty, it's kind of a natural pull to. And so, I have her at different stages in her life having different relationships. But one of the most scandalous ones was the one where she has a relationship with a minister of the church, the Reverend Smythe, when she's working as a servant in his house at the orphan school. And that actually came from me actually finding a birth certificate for a great-great-grandmother where the father's name, I was absolutely amazed. I went, oh, the father's name, it's this, I'm not going to mention the name in case someone wants to sue me or something. And it was the name of a very famous reverend of the church out in Windsor. And I was astounded when I saw this document. I thought, that can't be right. Surely not. And my husband, Michael, said, oh, no, he was a very respectable man. He couldn't possibly be the father of that Aboriginal child. And I'm like, well, I don't know about that. Maybe, possibly. Anyway, but that very idea that the that, you know, one of my great-great-grandfathers was actually a reverend of the church, I found kind of amazing and hilarious at the same time. And so, of course, this kind of stirred up all sorts of ideas for recreating this story in my novel.
Well, amazing and hilarious could describe some of the sex scenes.
Yes.
In the book.
I like writing sex scenes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm wondering about that. There's plenty of great sex in this novel. And is that because you like writing sex scenes?
I cut most of it out.
Look, it's not just erotica, ladies and gents. But, you know, I'm wondering, is there a specific reason for having them in?
That's a very good question. When I did the first draft, one of my editors, she wrote to me and she said, Julie, she said, I think you've created a new genre. It's Aboriginal historical novel erotica. A whole new genre, but you might find it difficult to get it published. And I said, oh, you mean I've got to take out all those erotic scenes? And she said, well, I would suggest that you certainly pull them back a little. So I did. And in fact, I had to be asked by Rachel Ansara at Magabala. She said, there seems to be a scene missing with the Reverend and Mary. I said, well, I decided to leave that out because people just think, will start telling me I'm just a writer of dirty books. I wanted to kind of show them that I'm much deeper than that. Anyway, she said, no, I think you need that scene, so write it. So I said, I'll write you a scene. I'll make it simmer off the paper.
I think it is deeper. I mean, my reading of it is that these sex scenes or passages in a story about a woman who, in her own way, is a resistance fighter.
Yeah.
You can't not have sex scenes in that.
No. But also, I didn't want her to be a victim. I wanted her to be a person who was, to the extent that she was a servant and mistreated in many ways, but that she had the power sometimes to seduce, if she wanted to, her own lovers, the power to choose a relationship, like when she chooses the young Frenchman who's the juggler, and that I really was very determined she wouldn't be perceived as a victim, and that, you know, even though women have to live under a patriarchy and have had to live under racism, Aboriginal women, the fact that most of the Aboriginal women I know, sisters and aunties and people, are some of the strongest human beings I've ever met in my life, and incredibly resilient and tough, and are at the very heart of their communities. And I wanted to make sure that we could see that in her, despite the fact that she endured a lot of colonial oppression.
I mean, I think the question I'm about to ask you is a bit naff, but I'm interested nonetheless. What do you want readers to take away from this book?
I hope it makes people rethink the history of Sydney. So it's, you know, we grew up, when I grew up in the 1950s and 60s, all the history we ever got was Blaxland, Wentworth and Lawson crossed the Blue Mountains in 1813. And you know, virtuous and wonderful Governor Lachlan Macquarie and fabulous Governor Phillip. But what a lot of rubbish. You know, that actually it's a much more complex and interesting story. And if we only take the English, the white Australian view of our history, then we're losing half of the story completely. Not to mention, there's no mention of, you know, the Afghans and the Chinese and the Indians and all the other interesting people that were part of Australia's early history as well. And I just think it's time that all these voices spoke up and said, there's another way. We need to take back the telling of these stories. And, you know, the subalternism, that's what's called intellectually, is that, you know, that the people that have been the underclass write back the history and command that people will listen to another side of the story.
Great. I've got 1,000 questions for Julie, but I can ask them anytime. I feel like I should hand it over to you guys out there.
We've only got one question come in so far, so we might take this one and I'll hand back to you, and then if I get any more come in, then I can jump in with them, if that's okay with you both. So Geraldine says, wonderful story, Julie. When I read your book, I could see vividly the landscape, hear the birds, smell the bush, the smoke. How did you develop such a sense of place?
Sorry, can you repeat that question again?
Yeah, of course. Did it cut out a bit?
Yeah, well, I've tried to put it on gallery view so we can see you all, but it seems to cut out when we do that.
Sorry. The question was from Geraldine, and she says, "It's a wonderful story, Julie. When I read your book, I could see vividly the landscape, hear the birds, smell the bush, the smoke. How did you develop such a sense of place?"
Well, I know Geraldine. She's in my writers group, the Celestials. She's a wonderful writer herself. So hello, Geraldine, I love you. I love the bush. I grew up going to the bush every afternoon after school and every weekend. We lived in the bush, right in the middle of Sydney, you know, in Boronia Park Bush. We spent all our time down there. And I'm, like a lot of Australians, I have a very strong connection to the natural wildlife. And I think a lot of people of Aboriginal descent have this very strong feeling about the bush. When I go into the bush, I feel like the bush puts its arms around me and I'm protected. And where I've been living previously to this on the northern beaches in Sydney, there's an Aboriginal site that's very, very special. I'm not going to name the park because we have to protect it, but it's a 2,500-year-old burial of an Aboriginal woman with her arms over her chest with a baby under her arms, and she has a gypsum cap. Gypsum's a clay on your head to show that she was in mourning when she died. That was 500 years before Christ, the birth of Christ. And she's buried there in this particular rock shelter in Avalon. And that kind of ancient burial, which predates Europeans arriving in this country by 2,000 years, is kind of what also the bush means to me, that there are very special sites that have to be protected. There's rock engravings, there's women's sites, there's men's sites. But the bush itself, down here, I was down here in Muraging when the fires were on, and so was Alice. And to see the bush burn and drive through it now, and there's nothing but charcoal. There's not a bird, not a kangaroo, not a wallaby or a wombat in those places where it incinerated. And it just makes me think, we have to do something about climate change and try and save this environment.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you a question about that. But
I had another one come in if you like.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Suzanne Ingleton says, "Hi Julie, I'm yet to read it, but with all the stories you discovered in that early job, does this story follow one story that you found, or is it an amalgamation, or were there parts, the direction that were unknown at first but revealed themselves to you, as this does for a writer?"
Yes, it's a good question. Suzanne's a wonderful playwright herself and an actress from Melbourne, so I love you, Susan. Hello. Nice to see you, Suzanne. I think it's a combination of those things. I think you start, I like to plan when I'm writing a novel. I used to do, by the seat of my pants. And I think you have to write twice as much. You end up writing 4 times longer than a novel. I'm now beginning to realise that a good solid plan can be very helpful. But each time you create an incident, it would lead you down the intuitive and creative path that you don't know you're going to get there. It's something instinctual, as Suzanne would know, because it's the way she writes too. And look, you just have to trust that creative impulse and not push it away, even if it'll sometimes send you down paths that are completely ridiculous. Like I had this great big scene in the middle of the novel where Mary's in prison, and I had this prison guard talking to her and refusing to give her something to eat. And I clung on to this scene because I thought it was so important, because it was one of the first things I'd written. And in the end, it ended up being about 5 lines long, because the novel was bigger than that, and there was more to the novel than that scene. But yeah.
I'm always interested in different writers' practice, their daily practice, if it is daily. What's yours around writing?
Well, like when I'm hot, and when I'm not, I'm not. I try to write, I try to sit down in front of the computer and not do the business. A business of a writer is you've got to do lots of things. You've got to promote, you've got to research, you've got to do lots of things. But the actual business of creative writing, to try to make sure that I sit down there for at least half an hour a day. It sounds pathetic, but even 10 minutes is better than nothing. To make myself write something new. And then once I'm actually up and running and a novel's beginning to cook, sometimes I'll write 4 or 5 or 6 hours a day. And in the case of when I wrote the Lighthorse Ghost, I went quite manic, and I was getting up at 2 o'clock in the morning and going writing Don't do that, all those writers out there. It sends you quite mad and you become this sort of strange babbling person who corners people on streets and babbles incoherently, and they think about calling the psychiatric centre. Look, I don't know. All I can say is that when I'm really cooking up something, I could be going along in the car and Michael will be driving somewhere really nice like Burke or something, and I'll suddenly grab a scrap of paper and I'll start writing, and he'll turn the radio off and just kind of write, because he knows that I'm writing, that I've suddenly had an inspiration about something that I want to write. And I'll write on all sorts of different things. And I've taken a lot to writing on an iPhone. I write on the iPhone. I send it all to myself. That's great because you can just cut and paste it into the manuscript. Yeah.
Yeah. I've got another question, but do we have any from the floor?
Yes, we've had one more come in.
Okay.
This is Matt with Virginia and Jessica. Julie, touching on the history of Sydney resonated with me, and I agree. What a load of crap with the focus on the settlers, etc. I think there 100% needs to be more focus in our education system on our true Indigenous heritage. What do you think needs to be done so that we don't completely lose the linguistics and also the truth, and have integrated so that there sustains much more respect looking forward?
Wow. Okay. Thank you, Matt. Lovely question. Too difficult. Like an essay. I think, look, I'm not a person who bags out the education system. I've been a teacher in ordinary schools, a teacher in Aboriginal schools, and a teacher of Aboriginal education at universities. I think teachers and even education departments do a wonderful job here in Australia. They really, really try very hard. There's an Aboriginal perspective across the curriculum in New South Wales. There's fantastic resources. There's amazing Aboriginal researchers and academics who work on this kind of stuff as well, even with ordinary teachers. I think that, we are trying very hard. I won't, and I've seen this great growth in appreciation of Aboriginal culture and Aboriginal language, mostly through schools. When I was teaching in a school only about 6 years ago, it was compulsory in year 9 to spend 6 months on the Aboriginal history of New South Wales. It was just compulsory. Every single child had to learn that, and they still do. And that's something I have great pride that we have an education system that requires that. I think we've come a long way. And the day when it was the national apology with Kevin Rudd, I was actually teaching at the school, local school in the Northern Beaches. And the whole school, 800 children were taken into the gymnasium. Everyone sat on the floor. Big screen was put up, and there was Kevin Rudd. Now, normally, you put all the children from the high school in one room. There's a lot of noise, there's a lot of misbehaviour, there's people throwing spitballs or, people swearing. Absolutely dead silent. They sat there with their mouths open, watching him give that apology. You could have heard a pin drop in the room. And I had this huge pride and tears almost in the children of Australia who could sit there and listen to that apology with a great deal of sincerity. And I just, I have tremendous hope for this country.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it sounds like you do have a lot of hope, and going wider beyond children's education. What are you seeing and what are you hoping for?
I hope that a lot of, very broad question, but in terms of, say, we'll stick to writing, a lot of young writers out there, or writers of any age really, to embrace that Australia has an Aboriginal history, and it also has a history of Chinese and Italians, and to embrace that multicultural history as well as the Aboriginal history, and to learn about it, and to be respectful, and not to just try to have an English history of Australia, because it's such a lie, and such a sad and pathetic lie, and it's really
yeah, absolutely. We've had a couple more, so I might go ahead with them if that's okay. So this one is from Gary Cromie. Gary says, love the novel, Julie. It has screenplay written all over it, a movie to be made. Made me laugh and made me cry. Above everything else, helped me see through Aboriginal eyes, in brackets reversing the gaze, during the early phase of the first wave of the civilizing mission. Was there any particular historian you consulted or read during your writing of the novel?
it's a good question, because you do read a lot of other people's work when you're writing a novel. Well, I do. I think it's important, especially when you get a bit kind of stopped. I love all Peter Reid's work. He's written, the 30 Years' War, down there on the Kara mission. I like the work, of Anita Heiss and I like, the stories by so many different Aboriginal writers. And I find if I constantly dip into what other people are writing, it encourages me to keep on going. I can't really specify anything in particular. I had to read a lot of history and a lot of original documents when I was writing Benevolence, and they're often very stiff in the way they're written. But I also had to try to find a voice that represented the Europeans in my novel when they were speaking from a period from 1816 through 1843, to find voices that resonated as they were. Because initially, when I first began to write, their voices, they were very modern, and you have to take on board. So you've got to read a lot of, like Jane Austen, to get the language, so that you have that kind of very formal English language in parts of the novel, to try to restore the historical resonance.
This last question is from Natasha Solomon. Natasha says, I loved the way you talk about your own growing up on the Hawkesbury. It feels like the river was a workplace, a source of food, a source of pleasure, and like a living organ itself. Can you perhaps comment on how we can look upon nature through the eyes of Indigenous people and consider nature as part of ourselves rather than something outside of who we are? I think that's a great last question.
Yeah, well, I think the important thing is not to abuse it. I mean, with the early accounts of Aboriginal people observing English people on the Hawkesbury River and around Palm Beach, which is depicted in my novel, was that the English sailors would go out and they would bring in longboats with thousands of crayfish in it, right? Thousands. And they'd pile them on the beach and they'd feed them to the pigs. Now, for Aboriginal people watching that, they cried, because for them it was such a disregard for nature, and it's so greedy. And I've been in Arnhem Land where I've seen, Yolngu men watching white fellas who are, say, working at the school come in and load, 20 or 30 fish and put them in a freezer and take them off. And they just simply, too polite to actually say to the white fellas, don't do that. Just shook their heads and just said, why so greedy? You only need 2 or 3 fish for tonight. And to not abuse nature, not abuse the rivers, not abuse the earth's resources, and show some respect.
Well, those are all the questions that I've had, so I might hand back to you, Alice, if that's okay.
Yeah, no, great.
For one final question, because we've got 5 minutes.
One final question has to be, what's next, Julie Janson?
I'm glad you asked that. I've been working for the last year and a half. That's why when people shout out things like, what's Mary doing on the mountain? I sometimes have no idea what they're talking about. I've been working on a novel called Wilga, and Wilga is based on my award-winning play Gunjies. And it's about a river again. It's about the death of a river. It's about the death of the Darling River, how the Darling River died last year. It's come back to life now, but for a long period it was completely dry. And I decided to make the death of that river, it's like the death of a young man was a metaphor for the death of that river. And so I've written this novel called Wilga. I'm on about the 3rd draft. I'm still looking for a publisher for it. But it's a novel where I celebrate contemporary Aboriginal people, and especially contemporary women who are older. I thought I've written a couple of novels now where I've had young women as the protagonists. It's time to celebrate all those aunties and sisters and wonderful women that I've worked with and had the privilege to learn from so much. Everything I really know has come from them, working alongside of them. Everything I know about what to eat in the bush and how to behave and the spirit world all came from these wonderful women. So I've got a couple of, it's a protagonist is a mature Aboriginal woman. She's got a very feisty sense of humour, and she does still like to have sex occasionally.
Fantastic.
That's a perfect place to end on.
I think so too.
Let you go to bed tonight with that.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. A huge thank you to you both, Julie and Alice. Congratulations, Julie. I'm now going to unmute everybody so that they can say hello and thank you, and then we will end the session for this evening. So if you get cut off, I'm sorry about that, but I'll leave it open for a couple of minutes for everybody to chat. So thank you again.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
You're very welcome. The link to purchase Julie's Benevolence is in the chat box. If you haven't seen it, I'm going to share it again for these last couple of minutes, and you are now all being unmuted. So please join me in thanking Julie and Alice.
Well done.
Judy, family. Everybody. Gorgeous.
The river alive for me. Thank you so much, Julie.
Oh, good.
I lived on the Hawkesbury.
Oh, lovely.
It's just wonderful. I so look forward to reading it. Thank you so much.
Enjoy.
Thank you.
Yeah. Mountains and
Thank you very much, everybody. Have a lovely evening.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good job.